Hello and welcome. I'm Jeff Schollenberger, and this is Compact Conversations, the podcast where I sit down with one of Compact's contributors to discuss one of our articles. And this week I'm joined by Holly Buck, a sociologist at the University of Buffalo, who has written for us on the rise of green MAGA. So thanks so much for joining me, Holly.
I'm so glad to be here.
So the subject under discussion sort of started coming to my attention a few years ago. And you call it para-environmentalism. Uh, Green MAGA might be one subset of it. Associated with particularly RFK Jr., who's now a nominee for Trump's cabinet. But the thing that first started catching my attention was another figure kind of in this orbit of disaffected Democrats who have sort of drifted into the MAGA sphere, which is Naomi Wolf, who many people will be familiar with as somebody who was kind of a mainstream feminine, kind of liberal feminist writer who now is, a regular on Steve Bannon's War Room podcast, and like Kennedy, known for her strong views against vaccines. But the thing that started catching my attention, I think a few years ago, was a lot of times her Twitter feed would just be photos of clouds. And not just her, but she'd retweet all these people in her replies. And there were just these people, basically posting endless photos of clouds and kind of scrutinizing the clouds. And I was initially kind of baffled by this, but it turned out what they were talking about was that by looking at these clouds, you could tell which ones were sort of natural and which ones were, according to them, geoengineered or artificial clouds produced by some, secret behind the scenes scheme. And of course, this took me back to a story I'd been familiar with some years prior, which is the notion of chemtrails. And so it seemed both continuous with that and also to represent maybe something different. So I'm sort of curious, that was it's all kind of vague, but I think I first started seeing just this fixation on Naomi Wolf's part and that of many of her followers on clouds, which clued me into this growing concern about geoengineering. Now, you've written a book about geoengineering a few years ago. And so it's obviously an area you know more about, but I'm curious when you first started becoming aware of this sort of strange interest in geoengineering among people who would usually be thought of as sort of conspiracy theorists by mainstream commentators.
So I've been working on geoengineering for about 15 years, and to be very clear, when I say working on, I mean writing about, not doing or endorsing, just to make that clear. Because I'm a sociologist that's concerned about climate change and concerned about the slow pace of climate progress, and have been interested in the politics of doing research on these technological interventions. So the main idea being to put particles into the stratosphere to block a small fraction of incoming sunlight and cool the planet, which sounds wacky when you say it, but scientists have been researching this for a long time. And so I would go to scientific conferences, talk with them, learn from them, and often back in the early to mid 2010s, there would be a handful of chemtrails protesters at these conferences. And so, as a sociologist, I found that really fascinating and I wanted to hear what they were thinking about. And so, it's been a thread I've been paying attention to for about a decade, but it's changed over time, as I talk about in the article.
Yeah. So the thing that first, I suppose, made me interested in this was that you had people who might have differing views about climate change. I think some of whom, in the Naomi Wolf sphere, might dismiss the standard account of sort of anthropogenic climate change as a hoax or some kind of globalist plot to legitimize or provide cover for some sort of great reset. But at the same time, they have their own sort of theory of climate change, right? Which is that they look around them and see things in the weather that they think are strange, and at the same time, they believe that human activity is behind those things that they think are strange, and that they're often extremely anxious about. Um, and so part of what's interesting is, and if you followed this Naomi Wolf feed, is like people are kind of anguished by like that they'll post these pictures and be like, why aren't the clouds like they were when I was a kid or something like that, like or there's never like just a beautiful clear day of blue sky anymore. It's always covered up by these like sinister geoengineered clouds. And so something that struck me with that is like there is a kind of sense of loss or mourning that might be similar to that of people who are concerned and motivated more by the standard sort of mainstream narrative of climate change, which is to look around at the weather and see some kind of profound transformation, some sense of loss, and to see some kind of political agents behind it, or at least human agents behind it. So I'm just curious, what you bring up, this notion of the mirror world of which is Naomi Klein's term for talking about Naomi Wolf. I'm curious how you think about that kind of mirroring, and also the way that maybe there's a kind of communication, or that some of these narratives actually overlap or feed into each other, between the sort of mainstream and the fringe.
Yeah, when I talk about para-environmentalism, I'm thinking of an environmentalism that starts from kind of the same roots in the 60s and 70s, this concern about where technology was going, how it was impacting the planet, who was profiting from it. A lot of those countercultural concerns that I think people like me grew up, hearing about, um, a critique of dominant science. But when it becomes para-environmentalism, it kind of goes off the rails into this alternate reality that's not anymore attached to empirical reality. And that's not to say that people are anti-science. I think these people are actually really interested in science. They want to do their own testing of soil and water and all of this. They want to use the tools of science, but they don't trust the people who they associate with doing mainstream science for reasons, some of which I think are valid at sometimes, So that's how I think about para-environmentalism. I think it's important to recognize this environmental content at the core of it, and also this distrust of elites. That's, I think, is the other part to it.
Yeah, and I think this point about that it does kind of emerge out of the same roots. It is a sort of complex point when it comes to these narratives, because it seems to me there's a sort of way you trace the origins of environmentalism to a kind of hostility to bigness a lot of the time, to kind of big business, but also sort of big government. To the idea that these two, in the sort of mid-century, like post-war era, that these big business and big government were sort of colluding to um, cover up all of these environmental disasters, and to kind of protect corporations from any kind of accountability. And so there was this kind of hostility to bigness. And I don't know what you think of this, but it seems to me, one thing that maybe happens is, gradually there are sort of versions of environmentalism that get embraced by, at least, symbolically, often embraced by big corporations. They become kind of part of the what seems to be at least the kind of propaganda messaging of big businesses, like when like BP starts branding itself Beyond Petroleum and things like this, and there's kind of this embrace, which is often called greenwashing and so on. And so, there's sort of, I suppose, and I'm curious what you think of this. One way to understand this would be that, people for whom this hostility to bigness, is part of what informs their concern about environments in some way, might respond to this kind of corporate greenwashing phenomenon by assuming that there is something nefarious in, the sort of standard environmental narrative, because it's kind of become absorbed into this sort of sinister complex of big government and big business. I don't know if that makes sense. And so then you have this kind of peeling off of people who might have, and perhaps RFK is a sort of, is a unique example, but is a kind of prominent instance of this. But there may be many people who are, on a smaller scale undergoing a similar trajectory.
Yeah, a lot of the people who would consider para-environmental, they're not climate deniers or questioning climate change. Actually, I think that's one way a lot of us in the academy misread these folks. I think that what they question is how mainstream responses are dealing with it. So they're worried about the impacts of lithium mining. They're worried about, you know, children in different countries mining cobalt. They're concerned about the life cycle assessment of big renewables, and more broadly concerned about a loss of control or agency or freedom in this whole thing. And so, to your point about bigness, yeah, they're concerned about a global response that gets imposed on them and shrinks their way of living.
So another thing you bring up in the piece that might connect to this is this idea about the soil, and this, the one pair environmental kind of strain is fixated on the soil, and I did notice that this was something that actually came up in this interview that RFK did with Tucker Carlson shortly after he endorsed Trump, I believe. And so I'm curious, how that fits into this whole narrative.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating strand with the regenerative agriculture. So, where to begin with this? There's a lot of regenerative agriculture advocacy that's kind of anchored in Southern California. Maybe you've heard of this film, Kiss the Ground. It kind of tells this story about how the soil is going to save us by taking up our carbon emissions. And there's some, it's a real area of research, soil carbon sequestration. I'm not dismissing that, but it's not going to solve our climate problem. But it's been interesting to see how different pockets of people have picked up on this narrative as a solution that feels good, that's tangible, that's locally rooted, that you could cite in your community and have, local revitalization from. So I think that it's interesting to see that migrate from this kind of very liberal Southern California feeling to more of these libertarian pockets of the country.
Yeah, and I do also wonder how you see there being a kind of shift in environmentalism itself towards, I suppose, a kind of more technocratic sensibility, where I think, I mean, perhaps an interesting instance of this, which I'm curious your thoughts about, is like the weirdness of this climate summit that was held in Azerbaijan, right? A sort of petro state um, in Central Asia, which, or the Caucasus, which, is both sort of bizarre, but also it's of a piece with, the broader kind of greenwashing. I guess even these kind of corrupt, like, petro despots, like, want to sort of greenwash themselves in various ways. But it does also speak to, like, okay, so what is sort of climate? Well, it's this like distant, gathering of sort of global elites in faraway cities who are engaged in some kind of very abstract discussions of, I don't know, various kinds of trade-offs and, credits, and so it feels like something that has become, profoundly undemocratic in this case, like quite blatantly, because it's, being hosted by a sort of well-known despot, and highly oppressive one. And at the same time that it's, who are these people who attend this thing? They're just kind of these, global jet setting sort of bureaucrats. So, there's something about how, like, this movement which might have once been associated with these kind of people who want to be, I don't know, engaged with like the local ecosystem and have some kind of, you know, participatory say in, you know, how you know, these more powerful forces are like shaping their you know, the environments around them. It's somehow just become this strangely distant, you know, seemingly like profoundly undemocratic process. So I don't know how you think about that, but it seems like there's sort of a relationship there at least.
Yeah, I think these things are responding to each other, and so I think for my friends that are the jet setters that attend these summits, of whom I have many, actually looking at it this way and understanding that gives us some agency to reflect on what we're doing and maybe change our behavior. The other thing I would say about um, this is that's interesting is that traditionally this has been a critique of the left, this false solutions discourse, the idea that carbon markets are a false solution. We have like a whole host of these false solutions. And in a way, what we're hearing is another sort of false solutions discourse, but anchored in a different place, maybe with a different value set. But I think those points of convergence are interesting to think about. I think they can help us with empathy and figure out a way forward here.
So you talk about going to kind of, you know, local town meetings and places where some of these issues are being debated, and as I understand, that has kind of been part of your research in terms of just kind of going out and listening to how people talk about these issues. So I'm just curious, you know, what like what sense do you, you know, I think a lot of us may have a sense of it from certain prominent figures, RFK, Naomi Wolf, the ones I've mentioned. But, you know, what sense of it do you get from just looking at who are the people who are, you know, on the ground level, just kind of following and perhaps getting involved in these kind of para-environmental, you know, perhaps like Facebook groups or whatever, and are also, you know, as you described, kind of going to town meetings and like voicing their concerns about these things. What's your sense of the, you know, of that kind of level of activity, and also what are the kind of profiles of people?
Yeah, so I've been doing focus groups and interviews and just going to different meetings out in the world. And there's a couple of things that have stuck out to me that I might not have thought about if I hadn't been there. One is that people are just profoundly fed up with both political parties. Like, we could think about this as green MAGA, but actually, a lot of people were not really happy with what Trump had done during his term when it comes to these things either. And they just see kind of all politicians as a scam, and companies too. That profound distrust is kind of a diagonalist thing. I do think a lot of people are older. We have some data that speaks to that too, uh, from surveys we've done, and there's not just one profile. There's a lot of different things going on. But I think a concern about health, a concern about technology, those are through lines that the people share.
Yeah, I mean, something, you know, as you say, I mean, notably, RFK himself was, you know, previously critical of Trump while he was in office the last time, and in fact, up until relatively recently, was. I was sort of surprised that he actually got the nomination. I don't know what your prediction was. I thought that he just seems so clearly at odds with not only the kind of standard deregulatory kind of, you know, industry revolving door profile of people who tend to staff these sorts of positions in a Republican administration, but also with the kind of new Elon Musk, you know, sort of government efficiency type influence, which is also going to be, I mean, just in a concrete example, like Elon Musk is, you know, trying to get environmental regulations waived to blast his rockets into space in Texas, right? There are like specific things, conflicts that he's gotten into with the EPA over that. And so, there's all kinds of like really profound conflicts. So I don't know. I was kind of surprised that he actually got the nomination. I don't know what
Yeah,
you thought.
I was too. I wouldn't predict that coalition to last very long. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure it out. It may just be that Trump likes having a Kennedy around, and that's the main that's the main factor here. But it does make me wonder about the kind of longevity and potential influence of this. Because I mean, the other thing that's odd about it is how it can kind of cash out, I suppose, when it gets plugged into a kind of Republican coalition. It can kind of cash out as a sort of small government localism, I suppose, where, in terms of what it actually amounts to, it ends up being not really at odds with the sort of deregulatory industry agenda because it's just more focused on, I don't know, kind of symbolic peons to localism and things like that, which I suppose you can see how that's reconciled with with the broader coalition because it's just not ultimately all that threatening. But I'm just curious, do you see this political constituency? You say in the piece that para-environmentalism may end up eating the environmental movement. So that suggests to me, you do see it as kind of a rising force or something that has increasing traction. So I'm curious, how you see that evolving, and also, what you imagine its political prospects are, or whether it will remain a kind of anti-political movement on some fundamental level with perhaps a little bit of traction here and there.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the political future, it's more about inaction than actually anything happening that emerges from it. But I do think the set of concerns can definitely block things from happening. Um, Maybe I should explain my maybe it sounds crazy, the assessment that it could eat the environmental movement, but I think that it's a non it's a significant share of the population, not huge, but maybe 10% of people are really energized by this way of thinking, and maybe there's another 10% that are pretty sympathetic, and that's still a minority, but if it's a minority that's more engaged than other actors, then it's shaping the dialogue. And I think that as climate change gets worse, the sorts of solutions on offer that are debated will be more restrictive policies, or they will be things like solar geoengineering, both of which will energize this constituency. Um, and so I do think that it continues and grows if kind of the more mainstream environmental movement continues to frame its ideas and its position in ways that are going to upset the para-environmentalists more. So that's what I mean about there being kind of a dialogue or different forces that are responding to each other. It's not something that's happening independent of what experts in science and the media are doing. It's in relationship.
Yeah, and perhaps here you wrote quite a viral and much debated piece about misinformation, which you touch on a bit here. But the longer, the piece you wrote on that is in Jacobin. But I'm curious, perhaps in relation to this, you know, there's sort of a question of how, as I was pointing out before, it seems that there is potentially some kind of common ground here, right? There are people looking around at the world, seeing changes in the weather, um, seeing that things don't quite look the way they used to, experiencing a kind of mourning or sense of loss for that, and also a sense of loss of control of these things happening that they feel like they don't have any power over. And so, on that level, there is a kind of felt experience that perhaps provides some sort of opportunity for discussion. Um, but that I don't know if that's too optimistic, but I'm curious how to what extent have people in the environmental movement sort of noticed this or tried to make something of it? And then, perhaps on the other hand, how would this relate to your critique of this kind of misinformation framing that you've made elsewhere?
So I think there's different parts to the climate movement, and I think you have a lot of people who are on the ground across the country just trying to do good work. They're working in local government in the sustainability and resilience office, or they're working for an NGO in maybe a place like Oklahoma or Alaska or West Virginia, trying to further things a little bit. Um, and then you have also at the same time this very online, more vocal, I would say, climate influencers, although people critique that. But I think the dynamics there are really to speak to a base, to grow an audience, sometimes to get NGO funding, but really kind of an insular conversation. And their tone and their messaging can be quite different from the people who are on the ground trying to do this work in what's often a hostile political environment. So I think there's points of tension between those groups. And I think that this idea of misinformation is one because you have in, basically coastal elites, people in institutions like the ones I work in. I'm recording this from Harvard today, who are really focused on misinformation and identifying it using this mental model of it being a disease or an infodemic or whatever, trying to purify the system of misinformation. And their position on the people, um, maybe in the words of Michael Mann, sheep, right? That these are the voters. They're not thinking. They're just infected by this stuff. So that's kind of the mental model that I think is really dangerous because it makes the plight of these people doing work on the ground in red states or other places, rural areas, much more difficult for there to be these elite actors characterizing people in these hostile ways. So that's part of where I was going with the critique of misinformation. Like, it's not an adequate frame to explain what's going on. It moves the problem to the people rather than the tech companies that are profiting from it. And so we need to change how we think and talk about it.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess following up on that, I'm curious if you think there are, again, you've you described like going to town meetings where these, people are kind of raising a stink about what they believe are these sort of geoengineering schemes. What are there ways of sort of initiating dialogue that, again, I think speak to, I suppose, what I'm seeing as the commonality, which is this concern about loss of control, loss of agency, and about things changing in ways that might be that feel threatening and scary and traumatic. Um, but that even but then the narratives about why that's happening and who's responsible are very different. But it seems that there is a kind of commonality, at least in terms of what people are feeling and how people are experiencing change. So I don't know. I mean, are there better ways of initiating these kinds of conversations?
I think definitely. I think we need to make more space for emotion in our discourse more broadly. When people come to the climate conversation with our numbers and our pathways and projections and so on, we're not making space necessarily for people to talk about the terror of what's going on. Um, so that's one thing we could be doing differently. I think we need to also open it up from a narrow focus on carbon and emissions. This is actually one thing that I've heard RFK voters tell me in interviews is that they like about him is that he's not being carbon reductionist or fundamentalist. He's thinking about the whole ecology. And that's something that, scientists, we could do better to actually listen to and produce work that responds to some of these concerns that people have. Like, we do some modeling on, you know, the critical mineral needs of a renewable energy system. But we could do more of that. We could communicate it better. We could talk more about the sustainability implications and do that in dialogue with people rather than just in paywalled journals. And then they'd have more confidence that all of this was actually being thought through.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you point out, which goes back to a point you made previously, that in fact, the people who are often framed as being anti-science or uh, y- kind of diluted by misinformation. A lot of them are, as you say, actually like they're sort of trying to access these articles. I mean, in some cases, as you described, there are these weird cases where these articles about geoengineering will be sort of shared and circulated by people who have this, and these are by sort of people actually working in the field, but then they'll be shared and circulated, and things will be made of them by people who are invested in these more conspiratorial narratives. And so it seems like on one level there's also a sort of communication issue here, which is that when people are, we do live in this space of like context collapse. So when you think you're communicating to a relatively narrow group, often it happens that that circulates far beyond what you might anticipate. So as I understood it, towards the end of the piece, you're kind of talking about that situation and what responsibility it creates for people who are involved in these discussions, that actually often what you write in one context may actually leak out into other contexts and be discussed and debated and interpreted in ways you might not expect. So I'm curious
Yeah.
about that aspect of the argument.
I mean, fundamentally, I think it's actually a good sign that people are so interested in the details and they want to read, what the White House report said on solar geoengineering and what the literature says. But then they kind of pick bits of it and, you know, spin it up differently. But that I think it represents an opportunity if we had funded better science communication. I mean, the US just funded billions and billions of dollars into clean tech, but we didn't fund the social infrastructure that was necessary to talk about the clean tech. And so it's no wonder that we are facing this problem.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I like this point because I in a previous life taught writing in an engineering school, and so I was kind of obsessively bringing up this issue of sort of what happens when you take a particular document that you're writing for a particular kind of specialized audience and move it into a completely different context, and how do you sort of anticipate that, and kind of getting students to think about that. So it's been of interest to me for a while. And yeah, I think this is in a way a kind of, I don't know, I like the point, and again in part because it speaks to this thing I used to talk about a lot to try to get my students to think my class actually had any importance to them. But the uh, the thing that strikes me is that there's maybe a larger question, which I'd be curious for your thoughts on, which is how can science be more democratic, or how can sort of scholarship be more, I don't know, responsive to democracy in some sense. And perhaps this is one kind of small answer that people can think about what they're producing in a scientific or scholarly context in relation to this kind of larger democratic public that's going to potentially get their hands on it and respond to it in some way. But as a kind of bigger picture question, just maybe some final thoughts on how we can be more democratic in these discussions.
I mean, that's a huge
Very
question.
big. Yeah.
But one thing I'll say is that we need to make public engagement with, you could say public engagement with science, but especially with climate action, with the energy transition, into a political demand, meaning that we need enough votes to get Congress people to appropriate money to agencies to have this in their budget. Like, it's not just something that science communicators or NGOs or academics can fix. It's like a multi-billion dollar lift from, where we are with public awareness of climate and energy is still really low, and it's like an Apollo project to talk with people about this. So I guess my final thought is that it needs to be like a political demand that we can say, we need this, we want it, here's how we do it, and campaign for it. And right now, we just don't quite have the language. We're still expecting experts to kind of fix it on their own.
All right. Well, thanks so much for the conversation and for the excellent essay. And hope you will perhaps write for us again in the future.
Would love to. Thank you.
So that is it for this week's Compact Conversations. Thanks, Holly, for joining us. As always, remember Compact is an independent reader-supported publication. Subscribing gets you full access to all of our content, as well as priority access to our events. Please also remember to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite channels. And if you like what you're doing, give us 5 stars. Thanks, and see you next time.